episode 65 of Jung at Harp. I'm Deborah Henson-Conant. Oh, today we're going to talk about the containers of creation. I am Deborah Henson-Conant, also known as Deborah, also known as DHC. I'm a composer, I'm a performer, and I have an online academy where I teach improvisation to harpists all over the world. And my partner in Jung at Harp is Kathleen Wiley. And Kathleen is a Jungian psychoanalyst and has a wonderful also online program. We both play the harp, and so we call this Jung at Harp. And every Friday before we have this conversation, we have a conversation about what we're going to talk about and what's meaningful to us. And I'm about to start a challenge, a 5-day challenge for harp players. And so I really wanted to talk about challenge, but as we continued to speak, we started talking about the power of a challenge. What is a challenge? That a 5-day challenge where you learn something creative is really a container for creativity. Containers of creation and containers of creativity. I might change that to containers of creativity. And so we wanted to talk about that because I've noticed that when I do these 5-day challenges for harpists, people learn in 5 days what sometimes it's a challenge for me to teach over a long period of time. And yet, because I've broken it down to something very essential, which I wish I could do every day of my life, it seems to be very easy for people to get the concepts and then to move on from them. And so I was wondering, how can I do that in other parts of my own life? So Kathleen, what were your thoughts about this as we went from thinking about the specifics of a 5-day challenge to the more general, containers for creativity?
Yeah, part of I was reading this morning, actually, in Jung's volume on the archetypes and the collective unconscious, where he actually said that we all forget that consciousness is what makes all the difference. That when we have consciousness, when we have an awareness and a felt sense in our body of something that's happening, that we have it in a way that we're experiencing it, and our mind and our observing ego is aware of it, then we have tremendous power to create. And we are open then to all kinds of possibilities. And so part of where my mind goes with the idea of your 5-day challenge is that it is a container that's small enough, 5 days, so it feels manageable. Doesn't feel like one's going to get lost in it. It doesn't feel like one, it's not like making a 6-month commitment. It's like a 5-day commitment. And it then allows one to show up with their presence where they can then have a felt sense and a consciousness around what they're experiencing. And thus something can happen, something different can be created, because then we can tap into the whole reservoir of the possibilities of life. All too often in our complexities, we get kind of caught in these very complicated forms, structures, ideas, habit patterns that we can't find our way out of, because it's like it's like the labyrinth that, a maze, there's no way out. Or it's convoluted. So when we break things down like the 5-day challenge does, then we can find our way.
I'm really struck by the word labyrinth because it's relationship to the word laboratory. Because we were speaking before this about that a 5-day challenge or any specific something that's been broken down into a container for creativity is within a container. And yet a labyrinth is like, whoa, there is no, there is a container, but it's a container for confusion, and it's a container for getting lost. It's intention. I don't know. There are labyrinth walks where people are being guided through them. And I think that's very different, because you do want to get lost. You do want to lose some part of yourself by going through that labyrinth with guidance. I'm not an expert on this. I've only gone through one labyrinth. But a laboratory you described before. You said there's a test tube. The things go into that. And the other thing I was really struck by that you just said is that you're in a new environment. So I'm about to do this 5-day challenge. And the 5-day challenge is one in which, people come to this Facebook group and they also get emails, but there's a container. Each day they get a small, 10 to 15 minute lesson in how to do something. And by the end of it, they are able to improvise using this arrangement form. They don't necessarily know what they're doing. I'm not saying at the beginning, okay, you're going to do this, blah, 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 blah. I give them one thing to do and they do that. And by the end, what I love about it, just realized, is it is discovery. It is a container for creativity, which leads people to discovery rather than being taught. And then I discovered that after that, people need to go through that again in a different way, and go through it again in a different way, and again in a different way, so that they can eventually get to the point that they're able to use this creative formula which is the part of my academy. It's not, people call it the DHC method, but to me, it's a distillation of the form that's been used from Mozart through to Thelonious Monk. It's just a form that gets used for creating music spontaneously. And that's what people are learning in this challenge. But the big thing about a challenge is that it needs to be small and contained enough that we really can go into that creative test tube and come out changed, rather than getting lost as if we were in a labyrinth. Now, what would Jung say about that?
Well, part of what Jung says is that each of our psyches does have a direction that our own energy will organically follow, and that part of our work is to get into that flow or find that thread and follow it. And so part of what you're talking about with the 5-day challenge is you have the big picture that you break down into these elements that are digestible. And that, it's kind of like, if we wait for the things of life that are important until we know the final outcome before we take the first step, we're not going to go very far. We have to take the next step we know. Then the next step will show itself to us.
I'm watching what Tiny Comedian said here, that it sounds like a prompt more than a challenge. You give them a piece of something, and then put it in a ground that makes it grow, or allows it to grow like a seed, all learning and creating differently. Absolutely. That is absolutely right. That everyone will create differently because it is a seed. And it's interesting, container, seed. I mean, that's beautiful, because in a sense, seed is the opposite of container, and yet not.
That's right.
Because the seed is the container of the essence of a completely new growth. And I love that, because I often use the word blueprint, and yet that implies a sort of imposing of an idea, where in fact it is the seed, but the seed then also guides so that the plant doesn't grow down. I mean, it does, it grows roots, but so the plant has some direction in how it's going to be growing.
Well, we might say that the seed has the imprint. And for Jung, he would say that the seed holds kind of the archetypal possibilities, all of the energetic possibilities of what might manifest. And so that the seed then cracks open, i.e. it dies and it cracks open, but that blueprint, that imprint, that archetype, whichever word we want to use, then steers, directs, governs, whatever word you want to use, what grows from it.
Well, the word release is what's coming to my mind when you describe it like that. When you said the seed cracks open and it releases the creative power of that vegetable.
Yeah.
of that vegetation. So when we are doing this ourselves, so I'm creating this 5-day challenge. It holds a seed of improvisation, and that's exactly what will happen, is that people will be given this seed and they will grow. They will find their own way to grow within it. And it's amazing to me when I do these challenges, how people do apply their creativity to it. And now I'm also asking about me. How can I create these containers of creativity or seeds of creative expression for my own life without falling into the labyrinth of confusion? And because creativity can be like, blah, and I mean, the garden also is full of weeds as well. And that can become crazy once you start creating things. What tiny containers might I be able to create as a challenge? And I'm saying a challenge just because it means that I will think slightly differently and I will use it slightly differently. I will use my life slightly differently.
Well, I think one of the things, DHC, that you already encourage, that you do and encourage people in the academy to do is, I call it stream of consciousness journaling. I think you call it a little something.
Vision music?
Well, the vision music, but I'm also thinking about just writing, sitting down and writing whatever.
Sprint writing.
Yeah, spirit writing. I call that stream of consciousness writing. It's one of the best things we can do to just give ourselves a container for all of what's going on. The other thing I want to say about Labyrinth, I'm thinking about the Labyrinth that is a meditation tool that the Labyrinth probably you walked was modeled on the medieval blueprint of one that's in the Chartres Cathedral in France. That is the popular rose formula that a lot of churches and hospitals, anyway, people create. But that labyrinth is designed so that as you're walking in, you let go of everything that's troubling you and all of the things that ego and persona put in the way. Then you come to the center, and having emptied yourself, you receive. And then as you walk back out, you take what you've received out into the world, into action. Now, that's a very different labyrinth than the labyrinth that in mythology contained the Minotaur, the man with the bull's head that was on the Isle of Crete, that Minos' wife had been seduced to have sex with the bull and given birth.
Right, because that was a labyrinth at the heart of which was shame, a man's shame in his offspring, in his son.
That's right.
And trying to hide that shame.
And that was a labyrinth so well constructed that when people got in it, there was they were not able to escape from the Minotaur, and they were devoured until Athens sent Theseus, and Ariadne, Minos' daughter, fell in love with Theseus. And so Ariadne gave Theseus a thread. She attached a ball of yarn outside of the labyrinth and attached the thread to him so that he could find his way back out. And that thread, for me in Jungian work, represents our own essence, our own heart's desire. And that all of what we do in the outer world, whether it's what we eat, whether it's our exercise routine, whether it's the music we play, really is about how do we have a container, a way of bringing that essence out into the world. And it's amazing. And I was talking to someone I work with, an acupuncturist healer that I work with, about a shift I'd had in something I'd been craving. And I said, I'm just so glad, instead of it being a head imposed thing, it's just like I didn't want it for something, it shifted. And he said, well, and I believe this also, when things come into balance, then the urge, the impulses shift. And so it's all interconnected, but the key is following the thread that is our own felt experience, because that is always where we are encountering our essence and what of our own being wants to be made manifest.
I love what you're saying, and I want to pull up what Tiny Comedian said, because this is a container. I'm a writer and I've taught, and when I give a prompt, it can be anything like write about your first memory. Everyone will write the same topic, but no piece of writing will be the same. And I want to go back to, I'm really taken by why that labyrinth of forgetting and that labyrinth of getting lost, why that was created. I want to go back to shame, and I never want to forget that shame, at least for me, is at the heart of getting lost and at the heart of not being able to find my way out of that container. And I love the ball of thread, the prompt, the connection, the human connection. And I think that I just love that for me, that a writing teacher is making this prompt for me. I mean, I know I can make my own prompt, but there's something very powerful about that. This is connected to another person, another human being in some way. That ball of string is connected to another human being. And I don't know the myth, but my God, I hope that, I guess he slays the Minotaur, but I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry that the Minotaur is not seen for the incredible, amazing being that it is, because I feel like we put ourselves in our own labyrinth, which is a container of confusion, and then and hope to slay that thing at the heart of the shame, when in fact, again, I'm going off on a tangent here, but I'm thinking about what keeps people from expressing themselves and expressing their own heart's desire and expressing themselves. And it is the shame or the fear that they're not going to look good, or it's going to be wrong, or something like that. So anyway, I also love that what Tiny Comedian said is, by someone giving a prompt or a suggestion that can lift us from the burden of our self-consciousness and our shame long enough, and a challenge when we are thinking this is a challenge. Okay, I get it. There's going to be challenges in it. And so I'm embracing that idea of challenge. It may be a tiny challenge, but I'm challenging that. And that's going to be the thread that pulls me through. That's part of it and the direction.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying about human connection, of course, we say a lot because it's one of the fundamentals. I mean, what we all want more than anything is human connection. One of the interesting things about shame is Erik Erikson, who was also a psychoanalyst and trained in Freudian ways, went on to try and flesh out some of what Freud was getting at around the importance of eros and connection. And he observed and clarified what he calls the psychosocial stages of development. Psychosocial, meaning these are psychological states that get formed in relationship to other people. And the second psychosocial stage of development is autonomy versus shame. And he observed that between the ages of 2 and 4, how caregivers and people respond to the 2 to 4-year-old about their own autonomy. You know, we call it, the parents call it the terrible 2s and 3s, because what happens, all of a sudden the 2-year-old can walk, they can crawl out of the playpen, they can pull the dishes out of the pots and pans out of the bottom cabinet, they can write on the wall with their crayons, they have autonomy. And so that shame actually is an emotion, is a state that is activated in relationship to our having our autonomy. He then goes on to say the next stage from ages 4 to 6 is initiative versus guilt. So then we get guilted when we set out to do it our way instead of the way we should do it. And so these feelings of shame and guilt have to be healed, mitigated, and humanized in relationship to other people. And part of what you do in your work and I do in my work is we make safe containers for people to express, to have their separate self and express the way they express without shaming or guilting them. We encourage that. And that is how the Minotaur, the shame, gets humanized.
It's really interesting because I'm thinking about classical music and playing all the right notes, and there's nothing wrong with classical music, and it's beautiful and it's a way of passing on. But I'm thinking that one of the things we do to avoid the shame of being of expressing in a way that isn't good, bad, stupid, whatever it is that we're afraid of doing, um, is to play what somebody else has written. So that, and it reminds me of people who tell jokes that they're not making up something funny in the moment, but there's nothing wrong with this. But when we share what we love, when we share what we think is funny, when we act funny, when we let ourselves be funny, the classical forms, taking something that's already structured and created and then recreating it or resharing it, is a very safe way, or we think it's a safe way of being in the world. And when we're shifting, so what I'm teaching is people shifting from that safety to a different safety, the safety of having a structure or a container or a prompt for creativity rather than creativity written all out. So I think it's the difference between, if you're going out on a date, taking someone to a really fancy restaurant where you can be like, okay, that's going to be impressive, versus cooking a meal for somebody in which there is so much more opportunity for everything going wrong, and even if you do it right, the person not liking what you give them. But we come into this world and everything is so highly produced, from a piece of classical music that we learn to a movie, that we just don't know the power and the beauty of the essential. And having that broken down, again, I know music and I spend time learning how to break it down and how does this work. So I break it down for the people in the challenge, and I see what happens when I do that. And it's magnificent and overwhelming and emotional and beautiful. And I'm like, how is it that in 5 days people are able to do this thing that I could talk about forever and it wouldn't happen? And at the same time, I'm realizing I can break that down for that person because I've spent my life learning how to find the essence of that. Where is that 5-day challenge I can create for myself, or that somebody else could create for me, that would empower? Because this challenge empowers you to create anything. I would love a 5-day challenge in how to be able to not be cowed by technical difficulties, or something like that. How to engage with technical difficulties.
Well, but I think what you're saying, and that is worth our saying, is that just like in all areas of our life, we sometimes need someone else who is outside of us, who does see the big picture and who has already distilled it down for themselves in order to be with us and help us do that. And that's what happens in psychoanalysis and therapy and 12-step groups and coaching situations. It's hopefully the good enough of all of those. Then you're with someone who already knows how to do that, and who thus then can be with you in a way to give you a form in which that can happen within yourself. That we then internalize. I mean, part of what happens in the good enough psychoanalysis is that the whole method you experience with the psychoanalyst gets internalized, and then there's an inner psychoanalyst that you then are able, you go through that process with yourself. That's what you're giving people with the music, with Hip Harp Academy. You're giving them the method that then eventually, as you say, they do the 5-day challenge, then they do it again, that they internalize, and then they can do it without you or Hip Harp Academy or without me or someone else. So again, the containers of creativity and the container of creation very often does involve our being in relationship with someone else, just like Tiny Comedian
I'm
as
going to bring up some of the
writing.
things that Tiny Comedian, yeah.
Yeah.
So some of the things that are being shared here that are beautiful, that's the basis of language, which I find beautiful. A set of sounds is a container which grows into words, which grows into a shared set of meanings that connects all. It's the only, and then we can share our unique experience with this. So we learn a set of shared meanings. And then when you hit poetry, people take those meanings and open them up so that the language, that the way that we experience language in poetry is just like, that's all opened up, all our expectations. And then the second part of this is, then you have language that is fluid as it changes, because someone negates shame and changes the meaning or context of a word. Right. So we might have shame built into ourselves, and then someone gives us a new meaning. Like, I remember I had this idea. I noticed that my staff were really worried about making mistakes, and it was getting in the way of everybody doing work and being able to sort of expand outside of themselves. And so I created the mistake chart. And if you did not make a certain number of mistakes throughout the year, you would get fired. And at the end of the year, we would have a ceremony where you get prizes for most mistakes made, most expensive mistakes made, biggest mistake made while trying to avoid making another mistake, biggest mistake made while trying not to make the mistake that you actually made, stupidest mistake, and there were prizes for this. And for me, that shifted. And I think that's different than a container, but I think it's what Tiny Comedian is talking about, is that we have a meaning, and then it can shift. So I'm thinking about that with the challenge. The way that I do that is take written music, throw it out, and then start learning by shape instead. And then people begin to, as they play with that shape, they begin to realize that playing that shape sounds like music, because it is music, but it's music from a different, a completely different, what is that word? Focus. What is that? Perspective.
Angle.
Yes, that's right.
It's a different angle, a different perspective.
Right. Yeah, just like the mistake chart shifted us from, I can't make a mistake, to like, well, here we go. And every time you made a mistake, it was like, well, I get to put it on the chart.
Yeah, and I mean, what you did do is you did create a container for it, and it's a container that humanized it. You were all making mistakes.
Right.
I mean, Anna's saying you flipped it, you reframed it, a new perspective. And yes, but the reframing was to humanize it. I cannot overemphasize that. Really, what we're all still trying to do is figure out what it means to be human, to not be driven by the impulsive, instinctive, automatic patterns, and to not get disembodied in the spirit realm, but to find that middle ground. And when we get caught in shame and guilt that debilitates us, we're not in that center point. And the structures and the containers give us a way to begin to help move these energies. I'm thinking of the figure 8, move these energies to the center point, because that's where the human experience is.
And you're making me think about, as you say, center point, and move them there. And as Teddy writes, the way we learn as children as play, wonderful. And that's making me think about, what do we play with as children? We play with anything, first of all, but we play with a toy. It's not you have to do it this way, but it's a toy that will hopefully open up discovery and expression. Or we play on a jungle gym, which is a simple structure that does not have a specific guideline of how you are supposed to play with it. You are not judged on it, hopefully. Although I'm sure there's somebody who can make an Olympic, thing out of the jungle gym, and I'm sure they have. But this spirit of play that I love what Teddy's saying and what everyone's saying, because that's helping me answer the question that I came with today.
Mhm.
How can I build this for other people and it works, and yet be so incapable of building it in my own life? And what could I do? Like, even as I said this before, as I said, I want a 5-day challenge about technical. And I was like, well, what if I made that? What would that look like? What would be the 5 steps that I would give to myself that I don't give to myself? Because instead I sit there thinking, you're so bad at this. How come other people are so good at this? I hate technology. And
you know, I had this conversation with my husband last night and this morning, as he, the musician he is, was struggling with technology and was engaging me to help at 9 o'clock last night. And I'm an early bird. 9 o'clock, my little brain cells have gone. And, you know, I couldn't figure it out either. And I said to him this morning, there's no shame in what we don't know. We went to the manual. We did what was there. It's obviously not complete. Now what we have to do is support ourselves and find someone who knows where to find the file, who can show us. And, you know, in a way with Hip Harp Academy, you're showing people how to do that thing they don't yet know how to do. Psychoanalysis is about helping people discover how to do things they don't yet know how to do. The essential embodiment practices that I'm doing, the online circle, is about starting with the fundamentals, the basics, those simple structures that help us know what's going on inside of ourselves.
I'm thinking about, you know, what you're talking about technology, and I'm thinking about how I've been helped with technology. And I'm finding that, in fact, very rarely do tech support people take me back to fundamental concepts that would help me actually be able to help myself. And there's a big difference between a set of directions, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this, and fundamental concepts, which is, and I don't know if there are any anymore, if everybody's building their own apps, but fundamental concepts. Like, I remember with my first computer, like a K-Pro computer years ago, a friend of mine came over and he was messing with it. And I said, do you know have you worked on a K-Pro before? And he was like, no. And I said, how do you know what to do? And he was like, well, I mean, there's certain ways that computers work. I mean, this was 25, 30 years ago or longer. I don't know. And I was like, oh, there's actual fundamentals here. And I've had a very difficult time finding people to help me, aside from someone who has worked with the disabled community. And that person was able to actually give me some fundamental information that was helpful to me. So let me ask this: how could I ask for that how could I ask for people who do not understand the idea of how to give fundamentals? How can I ask? What is a language? And I'm opening this up to everybody. What is the language that I could use to say, but how does this work? Not how do I do it? How does it work in its fundamental ways so that I can engage with it?
Well, I think what I want to say is you can ask the question however, but if they don't understand it themselves, they can't tell you. I mean, the reality is that there are probably very few people in any profession who can actually break it down that way so that it is accessible to someone who doesn't have their background. You know, that's just the reality. Think about it. The musicians that you know and the consummate performers and composers, you know, there are very few who can actually distill things down to the purest essence and give it to someone else. So you can ask the question, however, but that doesn't mean that's what you're going to get, because you can't get it if the other person doesn't have it. And you may be dealing with a tech person who, and I think there are people in all professions and disciplines like this. They just have it, and to them it's simple, and they really don't realize the complexity behind it, because for them, it's just organically or innately there, so they don't know how to distill it. So I think,
this is why you have to go to someone who's not an expert. I mean, this is why you have to go to someone who has had to figure it out. And this is why there are things I'm terrible at teaching, because they were innate and I never had to break them down. And so I don't know how to teach them. But But now that I'm saying this, and I realize that my students, of course, get frustrated when I can't break something down. Of course they do, because that's my job. And I actually haven't sat down and broken it down because it's easy for me. And that is my failure. I don't mean that in a shameful way, but I mean, it's exciting to realize, wow, that is a challenge that I would love to take on, actually.
Yeah. My major training analyst, Mel Marshak, used to say to us when we were in training, if you use jargon, you don't know what you're talking about. Use human language. This is what she would say to us. You go through these training programs, and I'm sure, music's the same, and you learn all of these highfalutin concepts and theories. And, but ultimately, if we can't break it down to the felt experience and the emotional tone, and words that resonate, we can't share it. We can't be effective in it.
I just realized when you said that jargon is like the labyrinth of the Minotaur, in that jargon has so much behind it that does not let us in or let us out. And yet once we're stuck in there, it's very hard for us to shift out of the jargon. So what I'm getting out of this today, my takeaway for today is, first of all, I am not challenging myself to break down. I'm sitting there in disempowerment, and I'm actually, engaging my own disempowerment instead of saying, hey, maybe I haven't already broken this down, but how about if I apply the principles that I've used to break down music and break down these other things so that I have a little formula. Maybe it's the right formula, maybe it's wrong, but I'm going to try it. And how can I do that for my printer, which refuses to talk to me, and also things that I'm not naturally able to break down, like how to play the bossa nova, just because it comes naturally. So that's my takeaway is, hey, sit down and take that challenge for myself for 5 minutes even.
Yeah.
How about you, Kathleen?
That's beautiful. And so the challenge that I'm taking and the container that I'm going to give myself is I want to really be able to sit down with a piece of music that has a more complex left hand and learn to play the right and the left hand simultaneously. And I know that sounds so simplistic, but I'm giving myself a container of working with one phrase at a time, no matter how slow I have to go until both hands work coordinated.
Well, I of course want to break that down for you, and I want to make a suggestion there,
Okay.
which is that instead that doing that is great because that's your impulse. Consider breaking down the left hand so that you just play the first beat of the measure. Not every beat and note of each measure has as much importance in moving the tune forward. And so the first beat of the measure and whatever in the middle, so that's the first pillar is the first beat. And then the one in the middle, whatever that is the next. And I would encourage you, and I want to know what this means to me too, to also think about putting the pillars in instead of trying to get the whole lattice work in and playing the right hand with that.
Yeah, and what I find is that I am able to do that much more quickly and readily.
Great.
So I'm able to put the left hand in with one note or like 2 beats. And once I know the melody really well and I'm relaxed with it, I can add in left hand that's beautiful and a little more complex. Ha ha ha, trying to be.
Well,
but I'll tell you what I've been struggling with for months is I want to play Bach's Jesu, Joy of Man's Desire.
Okay.
And that left hand and my right hand together is just like my brain. So I'm looking at how can I create a container where they'll go together.
Okay, so I'm of course gonna approach it differently, and I'm gonna ask, well, what is Bach's Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring, right? What is it? Is it the left hand, or is it the melody and a harmonic movement. And who wrote that left hand? I mean, maybe Bach did write that left hand, and maybe Bach didn't write that left hand, and maybe it was for a symphony, maybe it was for two instruments, and somebody put it together into one instrument. So I always loved, and I don't want to. I mean, you're challenged. There's nothing wrong with challenging yourself in the way that you do. I mean, of course, and because in part that's your joy. You're getting joy from it, and I do like to ask myself when I think of it, but what is this really? What is really the music here? And what is the way that somebody else interpreted the music that I am trying to reinterpret? And is that getting in my way?
But I think what you're saying is so important, is that in music, as well as in every area of our life, we can sometimes set a challenge for ourselves, and we really need to check out, is this because the outside world says this is how I have to do it, and I'm trying to meet their expectations? Or is this something I want for myself because it would connect me to something inside of me that's bigger? And that's what your question gets at. Is this really the essence that I'm wanting to connect to and express? Or is it something I'm struggling and torturing myself to do because somebody else did it that way?
Because somebody else did it that way. And when you said the outside world, I'm thinking, the outside world that's in my head. And I want to take a minute to read some of the comments here before we end. Anne is saying, this is exactly what you often say in the academy. Don't ask someone who just does it naturally to explain it to you. They would find it the most difficult to explain what they're doing. Ask someone who's had trouble with it. And I think this is part of the power, for example, of the 12-step world. You don't go to somebody who's not an addict to help you. You go to the people who have struggled with what you're struggling with. And I know that there are other situations, but I've seen it there in just such a beautiful, powerful way. And Teddy's saying, bringing the concept needing work, bringing the concept that needs work to a community gives everyone a chance to contribute to the solution. And that also is so brilliant. And that kind of brings me back to something I was talking about with Karen, and that I talk about rounds, meaning giving a problem to a bunch of people. Don't ask them for advice, but say, what would you do here? And then you can see like, cool. No, okay. So I love that, bringing it to people. And here Anne says, the very successful approach that you use, Deborah, is coaching someone who is struggling with it, as it forces, that's right. So as it forces me to then break it down so I can help them. So that's a way that I do use my community. If I don't know whether I do or don't know how to explain something, is to find someone who's struggling with it, and then, just like Anne said, that gives that triggers or inspires my creative mind to come up with a solution for that person that then everybody can benefit from, including me. And that's why I love these conversations, Kathleen, because we start with something that one of us or both of us is struggling with, or there's a challenge, and then we throw it back and forth and we play with it. And I love the engagement from people who are sharing with us. So once again, thank you, Kathleen, for meeting me in this little box. And thank you for everybody, Tiny Comedian and Teddy and Anne and all the other people who were here. Thank you for joining us. And if you're a harpist, make sure that you join the 5-day challenge at hipharp.com/challenge. So that's hip as in cool, harp as in the instrument, /challenge. And Kathleen, remind people about when is your program opening up again?
Yeah, if you go to innerdivinespirit.com, you'll see in the dashboard essential embodiment practices, and we open up, the circle opens on the solstice, the winter solstice.
innerdivinespirit.com. Okay, great. Thank you so much to everybody. And we will see you next week for episode 66 of Jung at Harp. Thank you and farewell.